Hey everyone, welcome to my latest edition of the Ag Uncensored podcast with myself, Nathan Faleide, as your host. Today, I have a more of a newer colleague that I actually have not met in person yet, in Carter Willams. Although we're almost planning to in World Agritech, and then everything got busy and crazy, and that's how the world works. But
just missed each other.
Yeah, just barely with all the crazy meetings we had. I guess I should have locked in the calendar invite as you sent it to me, and then chaos ensued. But anyways, so Carter's been kind of, I'd say, what I've seen more lately, a leading voice in the conversation around technology in agriculture in many different forms, and has seemed to have a very interesting and great background in technology and beyond. So without further ado, first off, thanks, Carter, for taking the call and doing this. But to start, I guess, tell people a little bit about yourself and your story.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So we run a venture capital firm right now. My background is I am an engineer. I started early in aerospace engineering, working on fighter aircraft at McDonnell Douglas in 1989, working on the Super Hornet and X-37 and C-17 and a whole bunch through my career at Boeing between sort of the 89 through 2004. Very involved in Boeing Phantom Works and developing new aircraft, some of which you still have not seen.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds, just that part in itself, I think, could be a story. But like you said, you probably can't talk about it.
Well, when I first started at McDonnell Douglas, we decided it was early on, we decided the Gulf War started and we needed to figure out a way to deal with Saddam Hussein being underground in bunkers. So we built the first bunker buster.
Videos of that.
And that was
effective.
We took a old rusty cannon barrel from a World War II battleship and configured it into a giant long gravity bomb, which nobody had ever dropped recently. And anyway, so that's one example of many crazy things, but that was a great opportunity to really push technology and big change. I mean, when you're at Boeing, this relates a little bit to ag, you're thinking about the entire system. And as much as Boeing has gotten itself in a little trouble recently, you take the 737 and it's flown 16 billion people. It flies 25,000 flights every day. 5,500 people have died. When you look at the healthcare system, 250 people die every year by mistakes. So 250,000 people die.
I was going to say, my wife works in the medical system, and I think just regionally, probably at the hospital she worked out, that's their staff alone.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
that's a lot of loose bolts.
Yeah.
So, but when the CTO retired, I decided to leave Boeing for various reasons, and was involved in an early stage startup called GridLogix, which was an early IoT platform integrating building controls to try to improve building operations and energy efficiency. And we built a network-centric layer around thousands of buildings to understand their energy use and increase situational awareness around those assets. And just by properly optimizing those systems, we were able to reduce energy usage by 20%, and we could sell it purely on an economic basis of it costs less to organize this correctly. And so they call that the early days of data-centric and AI. Then did some work. We were bought by Johnson Controls, and that's now Johnson Controls building control product called Panoptix. And then a few years later started what is now iSelect. And what we were focused, we're based in St. Louis. St. Louis is particularly good in agriculture and particularly good in healthcare. So agriculture, the Monsanto and Post Holdings is here, and many of the CPGs, Nestle has got large operations here. So the food system is in St. Louis or right around it, along with farmers and everything. And then the Danforth Center. So a lot of real strong assets on that side. And on healthcare, the part of the Human Genome Project was done at WashU. WashU is really leading the way on neurology, on cardiology, and such, and cancer. And so we started iSelect as a venture fund to focus on pulling those two themes together. And we now concentrate in and around the area that in the U.S. we spend $1.7 trillion on food. We spend $1.9 trillion on the healthcare cost of poor nutrition. Globally, the world spends $14 trillion on the healthcare costs of poor nutrition. So that's diabetes, early death, all of that. Goldman recently said if we could eliminate obesity in the United States, it would increase GDP by 1%, which is a big deal if you think about each year, a 1% increase. So iSelect is focused around that problem. About half of our portfolio is focused, I would say, around agriculture. Half is focused on healthcare. The agriculture side, we concentrate on crop inputs, crop protection, soil health, agronomy, genetics, precision fermentation, things that all relate to growing crops or developing synthetic variants of it, up to the ingredient system, not above that. So alternative sugars and financial services to help different risks and things of that sort. And then on the healthcare side, we think about how do we make it so that people can take care of their own health? How do we get the data that says what is healthy? Right? We still can't decide the keto diets are good. So yeah. How do we put data wrappers around that? And we've invested about $200 million in 70 or so companies and continue to grow. And that's sort of what we do.
Awesome. Well, you're doing a lot and a lot of good things, to say the least. And I find it kind of interesting. You mentioned the bringing the technology or maybe the normal side of production, and then the healthcare side of food, nutrition, all that. In a sense, you're kind of doing what the Farm Bill is about, but more in a investment route. As you know, it's separated between the production side of ag and kind of the food side of ag.
Yeah.
Clearly, you're not the same, but
yes, I will say there were two politicians I know of different parties doing things related to the ag bill that reached out to me and asking me what the other one was doing. And I'm like, you guys do work in the same building, don't you? Well, you could go across the hall and talk to each other instead of bank shotting through me. But
oh yeah, well, they don't want to do that. It's politics. Well, it's kind of an interesting point too, because I talked about a little bit in my last podcast, and then been talking to more and more with others just from different chats, or maybe over the last, I guess slowly, maybe over the last 2 years, because and this may be a good segue into kind of your thoughts around it. Is so one of the major factors in how production ag and food in the United States work together, especially in technology and everything else, is because of how, at least in the United States, how the Farm Bill is set up, where you have, the food side, SNAP programs, WIC programs, all that stuff, tied with, the farm side of it, from crop insurance to other programs. And it's tied together for political purposes, really, so that it actually gets passed, because it's so important. You can have a Democrat from the city disagree or actually agree with a Republican from another city, but then on the rural side, you can have Republicans and Democrats agreeing with each other. the only thing they might agree on besides, a few other kind of ticket items. So it was kind of structured that way. But what, I've been talking to more about is there's always been a want by some to separate the two again. And part of my theory, I'm getting closer to that, even though I think all sides are needed. But I worked in crop insurance for a while and know a lot of others that, work in that game. And while I'm for it, there are inherent problems to it, just like with any other kind of government program. And there's a lot of want to change some of those items, but because of the political nature, you just can't, because those changes would just disrupt the whole flow of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of that on the technology end, the things that could be done for the crop insurance side, and then the technology end and the healthcare end of the food program that could be done. Some of these things that we know can be done to make it more efficient and better, they can't be implemented because those two are together. And the political nature of it doesn't allow it to evolve into maybe what it needs to. Does that make sense? What's your thoughts on that? Loaded question.
My thoughts are many here, so let me just lay a couple things out. Intellectually, the intersection of health and food comes around nutritional density. If you, as a human, you're seeking out the proper nutrients to optimize living longer and operate. And so lots of moving parts, but how do we put better nutritional density into food? And then what is proper nutritional density? So one is at the macros, we think about protein, but at the micros, if omega-3s and omega-6s are out of balance, it leads into an inflammatory effects and causes plaque. So lots of different dimensions of that. So one is the nutrient density part. The other is, and this has come up recently around an area, we often talk about food as health. There's a lot of very smart people I respect that have been talking more about food as medicine. And I might break those two down into food as health is I want to go in a grocery store and come out healthy. Food as medicine is I need my doctor to help and the healthcare system to help me be less sick.
That is what my wife does for a living.
She's a nutritionist,
she's a DNP, a nurse practitioner, but she's got a specialization in weight loss management. So there's a lot of that part around it, nutrition management, anything to help you get to a healthier weight and BMI, which is a multitude of options. So
yeah, it would be interesting to dig in on like Ozempic and stuff there, but well, let's just set it aside for a second. There's a move around the food as medicine side, which I know that the folks that are really at the core of that message and their motivation is right along the right direction. But pretty quickly, someone all of a sudden says, well, food is medicine, then we need to cover it. And so CMS should cover it. And so Medicaid should cover it. And then all of a sudden, kaboom. You've now got SNAP, Medicaid, and then you go the step further, which like Callie Means was on an interview and commented something I didn't know. Callie Means is one of the voices in this conversation. He said, apparently, that the Coke paid the NAACP $3 million to lobby on their behalf to make sure Coke products were covered under SNAP, which
that sounds like a very familiar thing on a lot of things.
Yeah, so you've got at one level you have senators that maybe have more of in the ag bill that are more concerned about sort of urban issues and how do we feed people right, saying we got to get rid of meat and go to plant-based protein, while also Coke is working its way into the system, I assume, putting more sugar into the diet. And one of the main groups, the NAACP, who's trying to protect those people, is taking $3 million to lobby on Koch's behalf. And so I'm assuming everybody's intentions there are good somehow, but I can't quite see from that story. It just doesn't feel like the right sequence of events to allow creativeness. And then the something I failed at. I've been thinking about listing what I failed at. One of the things I failed at was in 2001 or so, maybe 2002, we were afraid the air traffic management system could not handle all the growth that was going to go on. Well, everyone's talking about aircraft. Aircraft travel has gone up a lot. There are 100,000 flights a day of commercial aircraft. And so we were concerned that the U.S. air traffic management system, which is pretty much highways in the sky, and we were thinking that that increases flight time by 25%, flying down the highways instead of free flight. We were seeing the GPS would allow us to have a much more flexible routing structure. When you think about more flexible routing structure, then when do the planes show up, and can you control them, or they just get to the destination quicker and circle to be able to get to the airline, to the runway? So it's an immensely complex system very quickly, and plus you got to upgrade all the aircraft. They've now got to have, at the time, now they got to have GPS, and they have to have digital command systems across 100,000 different aircraft that were flying at that time. And so we were going through that whole process and trying to figure out at the same time, how do you fit it into the U.S.? And so I'm a technology strategist. That was my graduate work around that. In the Boeing Phantom Works, I was sort of that voice a little bit. There's sort of a few of us were like, well, if we look at where technology has worked, they've done this, not that. So I said, we should go to Australia and do it there. The idea being that there is no FAA there per se. It's an open terrain. Mm-hmm. Why don't we go prototype it there? And then if you're doing a giant system change, and as you were talking about the Farm Bill, trying to get all the incumbents to understand what we see. I mean, I just imagine everybody's motivations are proper here. And I'm going to be up on the Hill giving testimony a little later this month about what to do with the food system. I'm trying to sit there. I'm like, you've got people sitting here who've never managed their technology, and you want to tell them we should do the Human Genome Project of Nutrition. And I don't think they're going to understand a goddamn thing about what that means, because they have no life experience on what that means. And so I'm sitting there like trying to figure out how to get my testimony in 5 minutes to somehow explain the problem. And I'll even put a finer point on this. The CTO at Boeing, who I worked for at the time in Phantom Works, David Swain,
that's funny, because I interviewed a David Swain last week in my podcast.
I saw that.
Totally different guy.
So David Swain, who was a very effective engineer, an effective manager, an effective technologist, he used to say to me, he's like, we're doing all this technology. I don't really understand it all. Can you explain it to me? But when Dave was in his late 20s, the Gemini project was active. And one of the Gemini, if you ever saw Right Stuff, there was I don't know if it was in Right Stuff. Anyway, so one of the Gemini capsules came in 100 miles off course, which if you're picking up a capsule from an aircraft carrier out there and you're 100 miles off course, that's not like a little problem.
Yeah.
And so his job over the weekend was to figure out why, which was a mass imbalance problem. The weight of the aircraft was not exactly what they expected. So basic physics and reentry and whatever. But that was his job. He's 27 years old, sitting in St. Louis, Missouri, right by the airport, and pulling out bamboo yardstick kind of things that would be, if you're doing a spline, to try to understand a projection, you're doing a calculation, and like he's doing this stuff by hand with different camber spines, understanding the reentry in 3D space on a 2D. And that's what he did. Now, today, I don't think any human would know how to do that. And probably 99% of people who are engineers have no idea what I just said at this point. But the point is, even someone like Dave Swain, who was very good technologist at the top of the heap, needed help understanding things. And so my life a little bit right now is we're trying to make venture investments to get a return for our investors and encourage them to invest more. At the same time, we see what could happen in the future and how to manage this complexity. As an individual, it's hard for me because I've been in this world of when you're sitting in Phantom Works at Boeing, you see the entire picture. I mean, you see all of aerospace.
Sure. Yeah.
Nothing moves in aerospace without you sort of knowing what's going on, whether that's the most classified military stuff, whether that's space, Russian satellites with nuclear. We already know how to handle that. Why are you raising that issue? We figured that out 25 years ago.
You have to see all in that scenario because you also control it all. Or you do control a lot of it, that aerospace side.
But as a technologist, what I would say is you got to test some of the stuff out in some green space.
Yeah.
So that while you're trying to figure out, like regenerative, the best regenerative people I know are reducing their cost. They're not.
Yeah.
They have said, I don't need more premium. I'll take it, but I don't need it. But they've also told me most farmers won't be able to scale this because they don't have the.
I can speak to that directly because there's a lot of complications just to that part in itself, and could probably write a book on just the regenerative side and the complex nature of, well, for one, just what it even means to some farmers. To some, it's different. Like even in North Dakota here, some call regenerative cover crops or something's always growing to keep the soil active. Well, for half the year, our soil is frozen or very cold where things just don't grow. And cover crops can't really establish in certain areas. So it's a different background of what that means. So to your larger point, yeah, I can see that being problematic, and it also reminds me of with the drone space. There's a lot of drone development going on in North Dakota. To the same point you brought up from the FAA or from Boeing saying, let's test this in Australia, where it's really not done, and there's a lot of room for error.
Yes,
they're trying to do that in North Dakota too with UAS projects and stuff, and beyond line of sight. And I get it, but at the same point, to your point, it's like, well, maybe it will work here, but what works here in North Dakota for UAVs and UAS systems might not work in New York. Actually, I doubt it would work.
Yes, and I will bring up, we were doing a lot of UAS work at that time, and so our test space was battlefield. There's not a whole lot of FAA regulation in Iraq or Afghanistan, so we were able to do a lot of. We had a lot of free space to do testing in those regions, and we thought of it that way actually a little bit.
A carpenter my dad knows was just talking about his experience in Afghanistan, flying down maybe Iraq, I suppose, down the Tigris River, or Euphrates, or whatever, and he was flying like 5 feet over the river, and you can't do that in FAA territory, and he accidentally almost took the head off a guy on the river on the boat fishing, and stuff like that. But there are no rules there, so the rules are dictated way differently.
It lets you speed things up. So I think we, as we think about a little bit back to your farm bill thing, I can't even. I was talking to somebody on staff everybody on the committee staffs is awesome. I'll make some complaints about other people, but if you're on committee staff, you're probably top of your heap.
Yeah.
And so this individual reached out and said, somebody said I should talk to you, and what do you think we should be focusing on? And so I was explaining, it's like, we were looking for something simpler. I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, for crop insurance right now, what people have to do is they go to the local administrator and they draw a line around their plot and it gets faxed in. And we're wondering if we could digitize that with a camera and send it in. I'm like, what?
You should have them talk to me. That was my more or less job when I worked in crop insurance, was to implement GPS guidance and the data around it that a lot of people have into doing the actual reporting of where you go or what you actually planted. Now, and to your point on the picture thing, that would be an interesting conversation. I know of a simpler way to do it, I guess.
Well, but like the thing that shocks me from my world at Boeing is we were the original cruise missiles. So I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, but so let's talk about original cruise missiles. Cruise missiles were invented when Henry Kissinger needed a throwaway negotiation tool in SALT 1. Like, we're talking like 1972. And he said, we have this new thing called a cruise missile. And they threw it in as a negotiating point. It didn't exist. And then a bunch of people said, we could actually make this. So what is a cruise missile? Well, a cruise missile is a little teeny airplane with call it a 500-pound warhead. And so we built them. Williams Engines, which most amazing engine manufacturer that nobody knows about up in Michigan, developed the engines, incredibly reliable and efficient. But what do you do about guidance? And this thing's got to fly around. And you're talking, it's 1978, 79. You got to build, Musk has got 5 million cars running around with AI, sucking in data to do, automated drive to figure out how to run the AI. Well, okay, we can't do that. So it ended up that we used a 150 by 150 pixel CCD camera tied to an 8086 processor. Which, do you know what an 8086 processor is? The first IBM PC.
Okay.
IBM PC. So when were you born?
Probably 84.
Okay, so the first IBM PC, the 8086, but 84 we had the 8286. So an 8086 processor, 150 by 150 CCD camera. And at that point, DMA, which actually just used to have a facility here, it's now NGA, but they had a facility up the road here that nobody knew what it did. It was classified. It was originally actually the first DMA, Defense Mapping Agency, was put into the building that made Model Ts here in St. Louis. But so the DMA would build, and this is before GPS too.
Yeah.
So you had no GPS. So you got to have an inertial guidance system, which would get off track. And you have to have this cruise missile fly in low towards its territory and then land. So the guidance system in the 80s was 150 by 150 pixel CD camera. So it was CCD, a charge coupled device. So this camera that could 150 pixels by 100, like we're talking like that little GIF thing you get on an icon for a website now. That's that kind of pixelation.
Yeah.
And DMA would take satellite imagery and they would vectorize that along the path that this thing is supposed to track, and had an early stage imagery recognition that as the camera was flying on inertial guidance, it would sort of reline up and correct because inertial guidance would drift too much. We didn't have laser. I think we were just getting the laser ring gyros at that point. Inertial guidance now is done on MEMS, but just getting to early stages of of laser ring gyros, which were super expensive. And so you've got a basic inertial guidance that would start to drift a little bit, and you would use the camera optics to sort of look at roads, clearly distinguished items. So the guys at DMA in 80s would pick the vector line that they could sort of follow, so this thing would end up and hit the target accurately. And they bought a lot of memory for this. So maybe they had 128K of memory. 128K.
Yeah,
and that was etched into, that would have to be etched into an EEPROM probably, which probably nobody knows what an EEPROM is now, but you'd have to be etched into an EEPROM, loaded into that thing, and then shot on its way. And so now they're a lot more advanced than that. But I don't even know how I got into the story to explain here.
It all started from the senator's staff or whatever wanted to.
So
they wanted to make acreage reporting more efficient than just writing on paper, which is 90.
So in 1980, we were doing the equivalent of how to do scanning of stuff to drop missiles.
I'm going to use this story, I think, for all my crop insurance friends. Like, I got in a conversation with this guy that built or knew how to build basically cruise missiles that said, why can't we automate crop insurance reporting when we built this damn thing in the 70s?
On a whim.
On a whim.
It was Henry Kissinger, like, I need a throwaway item in the SALT talks.
Yeah, why? I mean, I know he passed away recently and naturally a very controversial figure in his own right. But why couldn't he be, right before he died, just said, we're solving crop insurance reporting, and it would have just got figured out?
So, I mean, you should be able to take an Android phone to if you have to use it. Actually, it's not that bad sometimes to draw a picture, because there was a certain what we did is if you go back to the original mapping software that used to be in was called ETAC, I think. What they did is they had a vectorized of all streets, and it would do a range and bearing calculation. You've driven this fast on this compass course and you turn, but it would correct itself because every time you make a turn, you could only do that on a street. That was the assumption, and the software would constantly update itself because it's like, you're sort of here. They didn't have GPS. You're sort of here. Now, you just took a hard left, so you must be here. And it would constantly recorrect. The guy who invented that was the guy who invented the yellow line in football. Anyway, but the technology exists, and it's just shocking that you poor people in ag are.
Well, I'll tell you why it probably doesn't exist in its simplistic form. And this might sound just insane in its own realm. So, the early 2000s, and now we're clearly getting into a whole different segment of this all, but it's all good. When they started creating CLUs, common land units, the USDA did, and the FSA would draw these boundaries. They would use ArcGIS, or they'd bring up people that have GPS receivers on their backpacks and walk fields. Most were drawn in by interns that never used a mapping system in their life, and they just got a black and white picture, or there was more colored imagery starting to come out, but a lot used DOQs, digital orthoquads, and would just pinpoint, where the field boundary was. And that was used as the basis for reporting, because in the FSA mind, it was, well, this is just what you should only be able to farm. So that's what you're going to farm. And so it just became standard process. So it became, here's basically the common land unit that is the area. And then the acreages, what people would do, they would just match it. They would say, oh, well, it's 158.3. I didn't plant that, but whatever, 158.3, easy math. And that was kind of the reporting method. And a big reason, actually, why that still exists today is jobs. Because to support that reporting process, there is an FSA county office in every single county in the United States.
And so you're giving
that
something for them to do.
that was their main job, a lot of it. And there's other parts of that, but a lot of it is they control the common land units. Well, if they digitize all of that and you just automatically do it, FSA is the largest employee group within the USDA. So
there you go.
Have funding. It's about jobs and funding. It's not about technology and efficiency, which, let's circle this big thing all around. This is part of the problem within the Farm Bill itself. That from even the administration of programs, the administration of, say, what USDA does and doesn't do. There, it gets tied into, is why people get angry at the government is it's hard to, once you're in, and people want to stay there. And so we have more.
It's like a Chinese finger trap.
Yeah. So it's why I feel a lot of it is why let's call it, a lot of the programs are messed up. Why it goes as fast or as streamlined, I guess, from your cruise missile thing in the military is because, well, it's the military Department of Defense. I'm not saying they have their own issues, but like, get it done, get it as efficient and perfect and all this stuff. And now, could we even use that type of technology with the secrets that you keep?
I'm sorry, which technology?
I don't know. Like, yes, the image part, I say, but I would assume there's a lot of stuff even within the military complex that would be great that we can use as a society, but it's locked behind.
Well, there was I was involved a little bit, but couldn't concentrate on it in terms of NGA, National Geospatial Agency, trying to take some of their technology and flip it into the white world. So I think that they do a lot of stuff. We see stuff in hyperspectral imaging that, maybe the newest hyperspectral imaging that's being used in agriculture is tuned up and advanced compared to what the military has. But there's a lot that the military had in that area for a while that nobody else had. And so declassifying that information, there was an attempt about 6 or 7 years ago to try to do that, and I don't know what happened to it.
Well, I know that's similar to a story my dad would tell me when he visited JPL, I think in, I don't know, 13 or 14 or something like that. And they were JPL was just given an NRO satellite that has been sitting in a warehouse for 10 years. And they basically, satellite that was in space fell, was decommissioned, and they're like, well, we don't need it anymore. So, and that was developed in the early 2000s. So in reality, it was probably really developed in the mid 90s. And they built two of them, one. That's how it works.
So they had a spare.
They got a spare. So the spare was sitting, and according to the some of the top JPL guys, they were like, we're 5 years away from building this optically. We have no idea how they do it. And so you're talking about top JPL scientists that can't figure out 20-year-old satellite tech from the NRO, which I just is a fun story of describing kind of some of the technology basis between what can be done and what most can see. So maybe to circle back, because I could talk about, I think, all this tech stuff with you and just in general for hours, but getting back to the ag side, is that part of, talk about the politics part, and then talk about the jobs part of the FSA, why the reporting side is kind of the way it is, why it's hard to change, and then it gets ingrained into the mindset of that's how we have to do it. And before we got on the call, I mentioned something that I think is a good transition part here is while you're working on and others, and there's a want and need, I want it myself as a parent to have better, more nutritional food out there, healthier stuff. But, to what I was saying earlier, I have 2 kids in daycare and 1 in kindergarten. Most of the food that is provided to my kids on a daily basis is through, say, the WIC program or through the food program for schools and all that stuff. And to your point earlier, a lot of this stuff, Coke got lobbied to get their stuff on to say it's part of the program.
Yeah.
And even since I grew up earlier, I mean, I remember when I grew up in a small town, grew up on the farm, but a small town of 500 people. Our cooks, up until probably 6th grade, cooked mostly everything themselves. And it was great, all good stuff, mostly pretty whole food type stuff. They made everything because they were maybe stay-at-home moms before that just were like, hey, and their kids were out and they're like, hey, we're going to make food at school. And it cost more, but it was better. And then things changed in, I'll just say, the whole program way of how schools would feed kids. Budgets went down, and so they had to buy more processed food. And I mean, the quality of food was crap. And, people didn't eat as much. We had pizza on the docket every day as an option. But to what I was saying earlier, before on the call, is you're getting used to kids eating kind of the same stuff. How do we bring in more nutritional stuff when the whole system is kind of broken from a young age to teach kids to have a appetite and a taste for the things that we know we don't want? Because that's like I feel like the crux of it for me as a parent with my kids and what food they eat. And I tried to think of how could technology help that? I don't know if there is a way, because all these layers we're talking about, all these complexities.
Yeah. So in general, if you're talking about, this is sort of set new standards. Mm-hmm. We had a standard of whole food properly cooked up through, call it, the 70s. And then we made some shifts and it led to a decline in quality of food. But in general, with technology, the better, cheaper product wins. And so my first reaction is, well, we need to make nutritious food that tastes better and is less expensive. That's sort of the easy box, so to speak. But that's and people are like, okay, well, you can't do that. Well, I don't know that you can't do that. I think that as we think about what might happen to the food system, it's very easy. We talk about the food system in 3 versions. System A, Adam and Eve, everything's perfect. 350,000 years of human evolution sort of knows how to give it to you. Your bodies are tuned for it. That's system A. System B is, look, the population's growing. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Let's grow calories. It's the green movement. It's monoculture. Yeah. And honestly, I think that there's a tremendous amount of good that was done there.
Oh yeah, I mean,
you did trade nutrition for yield, which is just a basic biologic function.
Yeah.
So now what we describe that we're trying to get to is system C, which is, look, we've gotten yield up. Now can we bring nutrition and taste back in? And an example of that is we spent a lot of time with computers speeding up the processors. Then we made computer processors more portable. So we're in that kind of transition where, look, we're still talking about the same thing, but we're going to express other features. And you saw computer processor costs still come down, and now we have very powerful computers in our mobile phones. And yeah. So as a technologist, that's sort of how we think through it. Now, what do we mean by price? Well, better, cheaper means that people feel they're getting more value from the new food. It may actually be a little bit more expensive, but that they're getting more value from the food. And what does that mean? Well, it may be that they realize that they're not going to get diabetes later, or They realize that they're going to enjoy sports after school more, or they realize that the kids are going to be less cranky, or so there's some things that they're going to have less depression, or you can start piling up that list a little bit. But in general, the way we sort of squint at this problem is we say, let's figure out reasonable ways to start boosting nutritional density without getting yield drag. But then the other part is we don't think it's all going to go back to System A. System A is fresh, perfect, Adam and Eve, apples, and this. And if you're trying to serve 8 billion people, you're going to have processed food.
100%. And I think you could almost say, I mean, there's been the garden movement, like, oh, I'll grow my own garden, and we'll have this inner city, like, kind of co-op garden where we grow our own food and all this. And it was like in the news for a while, but then it got kind of, the people that actually did it were like, crap, I spent 6 months trying to grow lettuce and everybody ate it in a week. And half of it was bad because we've never grown lettuce before.
Foodborne illness. I mean, people are like, oh, we need a whole bunch of smallholder farms. It's like, if you want more foodborne illness, that's a good way to do it.
100%. And and then others, try organic. And it's like, that's the big thing. It's like, well, there's issues to that too. So to your point, I know when my great grandparents and grandparents were on the farm, they had their own garden, and they put stuff in jars and preserved it, and that's just kind of how you had to do, because the grocery stores weren't really, like we see anywhere today. So that we can't get back to that. Our system's not meant to get back to that.
Well, and there are problems with it. I mean, this is we saw this in our supply chain at Boeing. The smallest suppliers were the guys who were taking chemicals and dumping them in the river.
Makes sense.
I mean, you just, but so I think if we want better food for our kids and everybody, the objective function has got to say, look, it's got to be better and cost less, when cost can include a bit of what we call in economics price elasticity. The price elasticity demand, there is signals in the marketplace that if people generally perceive this is healthier for them, that at every economic strata, they will shift and buy that healthier for you thing and they will decide not to do other things. So the price elasticity for demand in there is ready to shift. And so that's thing one. Now, thing two is, how do we do this? A thing that, and this could be a little complex, but let me just sort of step it out. When we think about technology in any market, there's a classic early adopter, early majority, late majority laggard. And this was developed by a guy named Geoffrey Moore. Great book, Crossing the Chasm, worthwhile reading. And when you look at that, it basically says there's a market and the technologies get diffused across this market over some period of time. And if you look historically, AM radio took off like a bat. FM was slow because everybody had AM.
Yep.
And then they had to switch out. TVs took out like a bat. Color was slow. And so you get, different things diffused in different ways. And it's this early adopter, early majority, late majority. So then you against the whole market. And then a lot of us in technology pay attention to that front end. Who are the early adopters? And then the right early adopters are people that can influence early majority. And so in farming, there's probably about 3.5 million farmland, broadland acres focused that are early adopters. And we know these people, guys like Matt Moreland and Kip Tom, and people who will go out and manage that front end. And they find new ways to do it, and they have the right skills and the aptitude, and then there are a few.
I call them my 5%ers. There's that top 5%. They will just keep on doing those things,
and they get it, and they've got the sequence, and it's magic. And then the next early majority is, call it, I think the numbers I'll say is 40 million acres, and they'll listen, and they're like, look, can you explain it to me? And I get it. Okay, now I'll do it. Yeah. And then you've got the rest out to whatever, 300 million acres. And let's throw a little confusion that 80 million of those acres is biofuels, and those are the different market.
Yep.
But,
yep.
So,
100%.
but pause on that for a second.
Yep.
So if we're investing in new technology, we're saying it's like, okay, how do we get the early adopters? Then how do we get the early majority to pay attention to early adopters? And one of the problems we had with Benson Hill and Plenish, and here are these early adopter technologies, is their sales teams were out cross-selling early adopters. So Plenish was taking share from Benson from the same farmers who are willing to be early adopters. And from an ag tech evolution standpoint, nobody was saying, I don't think, okay, hold on, let's speed up the process of getting over to early majority, because that takes us from 3.5 million acres to 40 million acres. And Plenish and Benson can both survive in that market. Now, there's a shitload of confusion about, does it go to ADM? Or do you have White River soy that maybe takes high protein concentrate and moves it down into food? And there's a whole bunch of other system complexity we'll just set aside here. But now, regenerative. And this is a new set of thinking that's confusing me. What I'm hearing from early adopter regenerative is it's late majority won't figure this out. And we saw this in the energy efficiency business. Some people were driving really effective energy efficiency measures early on, and we get to a certain point in the market would collapse because the chaos associated with what are those things? Or late majority could be smallholder farms. It could be less well-trained people. It could be generational transitions, or it could be they're not near the right crush facility. It could be they don't, like Matt Moreland considers his cover crop to be a rotation of wheat. Well, if Nestle comes through and says, we need regenerative and you got to do a cover crop, it's like, no, I do a rotation of wheat and I put 400 cows out there during the winter and they do their thing and I don't need a cover crop.
Yeah.
But you get, like, that works there, but then for the laggard part, they can't. They don't have the cows.
Well, and to my part earlier is, what ag is weirdly just complex in that nature. You can't have, other industries, you can maybe have more of a consistency of how you fix a problem. I in the healthcare, and I'll bring that up so my wife's in it, is if I break my arm and you break your arm, it's basically, there's a pretty normal way to heal it and fix it. Yeah, there are some variations into it depending on the different medications you take and if you broke your arm before or how old you are, stuff like that. There are variations, but for the most part, the bone heals the same. Well, when a same crop could be in even the same county or even a few miles away, maybe next to each other, of how one wheat crop and another wheat crop work, the complexities just exponentially grow because of how those systems are farmed, the varieties, the types of fertilizers put on them, how they were they're just different. Even every square inch of soil is slightly different how it reacts. And then if you spread that larger, it gets wild.
Yeah, so let's break this down into a couple examples. Going back to the healthcare example. If you deal with a bottom quartile population, 40% of them have undiagnosed high blood pressure. So that is a standard of care, determining high blood pressure. Now, if you deal with the medical system, I don't know if you've got this. I was an EMT. I was taught to take a blood pressure in the back of an ambulance with noise. So, like, look at the meter as you're doing it, and when I get my blood pressure taken, I would say 90% of the time, whoever's taking it does it wrong. And I'm like, no, it's this. I'm like, no. And the doctor comes in, it's like, she says it's that, it's not that, it's this. Doctor does it, it's like, you're right. It's like, okay, so if we can't even get standard of care at the bottom quartile on high blood pressure properly diagnosed for 1,000 reasons.
Yep.
That's one thing. But now let's go to your comment on soil. So when we think about soil, we've seen it from the full range. Like, let's just get the basic fertility right to no, we're going to get these microbes working in particular ways that solve all these. So we've seen that range. So you take something like Pivot Bio. Part of the reason why Pivot Bio, I think, is not working is because people putting too much phosphorus in, and it's killing off the microbes. But Pivot Bio doesn't even seem to be able to get that straight in the marketplace. I'm not positive that that's it.
I know the other reason is, and I talked about this, I've actually talked about this a few times in podcasts and just other conversations, is sometimes what's not thought of is, okay, sure, maybe it's the microbes are doing what they're doing. Maybe they are creating nitrogen in their way to supplement. What it's doing in a different process, and how people put fertilizer down in the top 6 inches. Well, in a lot of places, that's the furthest they soil test. That's all they know. That's their whole world. Say in the Northern Plains, sometimes we'll go down 0 to 6 and 6 to 24. Well, what roots do is if they're used to just getting nitrogen on the top, that's just where you see that response. So if you fertilize half the field, they're doing what they're normally doing. On the other side, you don't really know necessarily if that biological activity is supplementing, because those roots just maybe went lower into the ground where nitrogen, where they never really go, is sitting. So, and then you get into split trials, and different areas of the field are better or worse. The science of proving these things is shitty at best.
Well, and it's difficult to communicate that to like the peculiarity, and the early adopters sort of catch it because they understand it, and then as we get to the later adopters, and so this has really perplexed me recently, is like, and on LinkedIn, Walt Dufflick and I were getting into it a little bit this weekend, is, and I'm still not sure I've got this straight, is he brought up the fact that, what's going to happen with AI and ag, and Walt's more of a specialty crop guy.
Yeah.
And he reminded me that Tesla, to get FSD working, is taking data from 5 million cars to say what happens when you're driving down the street in a snowy day and a little baby's crawling across to catch its ball. How you got to see that? Which is, you need the real world data on. And I also heard this week from people I trust that they've been in various meetings in which it's become clear to them there's a limited amount of people that can take current regenerative practices and figure out how to work them in a profitable way.
Yeah.
And their point back to me was, maybe it won't scale. And I've seen that episode before from what we saw in energy efficiency. And so you put the two together from a technology standpoint. I then put in my lessons learned thing. I said, maybe we need to gather the data the way they're doing for FSD, which then led to, well, we've got all the satellite data, so we have it. It's like, no. I mean, 24 inches into the ground, what's going on with microbes? And what's the cause and effect and coupling of... We don't even have good root imagery data. Like, we do not have a non-destructive... I don't think we have a non-destructive mechanism to look at roots.
I know a guy that...
You do? I'd like to... Because we can't do it with Earth optics. And I think you'd need to maybe use... if you had an MRI, I think it would work, but that you'd pull the tractor out of the barn.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe you could use isotopes. But
yeah, there's God, I can't even. I have to look. I'll send it to you later.
But we don't even know root. We know a shitload about what happens above the field.
Yeah, the group, I can't think of his name offhand, but Landscan.
Landscan came up. Maybe you posted that. Did you post that?
Yeah,
somebody
maybe,
posted that on the thread.
Well, he's been doing a lot of stuff around that and was trying to replicate that into. He got bought by Trimble. He started to redo it now in some other ways. And he was saying the problem was, it's an expensive process, and he's doing it in high value crops because it's giant probe. It's slow. You can only cover so much, and then you get into broad acre crops where a lot of people want all this stuff to happen, regenerative, carbon capture, all this crap. You just can't. It's hard to scale all these things. I mean, I learned that early on.
Well, hold on. Okay. Let's go back to the air traffic management system.
Sure.
Go to Australia, test it in a smaller environment, come back. So Tesla's got 5 million cars to make FSD work better. How many acres do we need to figure this out? Like, if we're going to build an AI model, let's say, and this is some part of this, technically the right way to do this is you need a physics model and an AI model, a neural net. So the physics model is, I know if I put this much nitrogen into this crop system, it's going to do this. How I get the nitrogen there might be a biologic process, nitrogen fixation, or maybe it's fertilizer, but that's the physics part. Like, we know this input causes this. And then the neural net component would be something more in the microbes. So we know that microbes do what I call polymorphic. I don't know if that's a technical term, but they will adapt to solve a problem. So the ratio of the microbes and what microbes are there and which ones really express themselves, nature's figured out that formula a little bit, and they will, within a range, maybe in a range not with a lot of synthetic around it, the microbes have been trained over 4.5 billion years to adapt and express out what needs to be done. So that probably needs a neural net to figure it out, maybe a little bit more. But those two things brought together, trained in a broader situation, would bring it together. But I don't know. I don't know if anybody understands what I just said, and I'm not sure I do.
I get it. I get it to a good degree. My question comes up is, okay, sure, we can do it. And there's a lot of things we can do in agriculture, technology-wise, to your extent, in a smaller area. But, from when I put my farmer cap on, it still comes down to the time, getting even getting people to agree to do this in its own realm is tough enough to try new things, that the early adopter thing. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you could just go to these early adopter people.
So let me build on this. Let me build on it because your point's valid. So,
yep.
So the first, in R&D land, the question is, like, if I were Boeing and trying to break this problem down, say, okay, well, R&D land, we don't understand these correlations. Let's figure them out. And so that is, do we need to take samples from 2,100 acre plots distributed? Will that do it? Like, do we need 2 million acres, 1 million acres, 100,000 acres? So there's a little bit of that, and then we can build the model. When I started on the F-18 program, 10% of the cost of building that aircraft was rework. Bang the plane back together. And when we were building the Super Hornet, we're like, we can't do that. And people are like, well, you can't. That's just aircraft. 10% of the cost. Well, you can't fix quality. And so I got the Air Force to give us $5 million to measure the living bejesus out of the airplane. And I was like, and it was a Navy aircraft. So people were like, had it? And I was 25 at the time. So it was a little crazy. But anyway, how did you get the Air Force to do that? I don't know. we got the $5 million, and we measured the bejesus out of it, and we took it and we stuck it in we took all the geometry and stuck it in a Monte Carlo model. I'm running on HP 720, which has probably got less power today than your handheld. Ran on HP 720, and actually later on built a AWS-like framework. This is like 1992, AWS-like framework to share it across multiple to co-process it. And then we looked at all the variability that was going on in the model and realized, the reason these defects are occurring is because as far as the forging, let's make it a extrusion, because we have this gap on the IML of the skin versus how we machine the top of the spar caps. And so let's do this. And so we broke it down and basically said, let's change the design. As a result of this deep analytical method, let's change the design. And then here's how you should build the aircraft. And we eliminated $1 billion of cost on a $5 billion program from that and got Six Sigma, but nobody thought we could hit Six Sigma. The analogy here is maybe what we do is there's no reason to roll this stuff out everywhere.
No.
Some of the things you're hearing about that you've rightly, in a lot of your posts, like, guys, what the hell are we doing here? If in aerospace, what we do is we go over to this corner and geek out on it, and then reduce it and say, okay, it was too complex. We didn't understand the cross correlations, the covariance, but now we have a better understanding of it. We realize that microbes matter more than we did before. The application of phosphorus is killing them, so let's not do that. Here's a new recipe, and then that's a recipe the late majority can follow.
Well, I would say we're attempting to do some of those things. And I'm not saying it's perfect. Of course, it's a different comparison. But universities are doing a lot of testing on all this stuff, and they're trying to do it in very controlled manners and ways. Yet, naturally, sometimes the way they do some of those types of things are not probably applicable to normal ag production. Is very common. It's like, yes, we tested all these things. Like, yeah, well, you did it this way on these plots, and my field's got like 10 different plots in it. Like, what do I do on this type of soil? Like, oh, well, we don't know. We only did this biological test with XYZ using this data on a sandy loam soil in this part of the country. So it gets, that is the complexity of ag, and it's like compounded. And so I wonder if, and maybe that's part of the problem here, is with that testing method and that R&D side, there's just so much complexity in ag and soil and how this and that works anyways. And then, you got, like you said, a hard enough thing. You got $5 million from the Air Force to do this stuff when it's a Navy plane. A big factor of it is I don't think there's not enough money in agriculture to figure out these things at the scale that we need to. And one thing I brought up in I can't remember what post, talking to somebody the other day, is much like, your world of that you kind of started your career in, and you think of, okay, Boeing got military contracts to build their thing, saying, here's the things, here's what we're going to do. It does XYZ, and the government and people are like, yep, let's get some contracts out. Let's pay these guys to build what we want. We don't do that really in the USDA for agriculture. There are, there's grants and there's things like that. There's not like a bidding process. Like, hey, USDA has $10 billion. We're going to These are the things we want. Maybe is that a way? I mean, you've lived that world a little bit. Is that a way to get some of these bigger things done? Is to change the system and how we approach technology and ag and how we fund it?
Yeah, maybe.
Sure, private is, these public-private partnerships are seeming to work to an extent. I mean, you have SpaceX and NASA, and it's changing the dynamic of how we get stuff to space for cheaper, more efficient, because of the efficiency sometimes a company has to go off because they don't have unlimited budgets. So, the government does, in a sense. Maybe that's how this has to be handled and tackled, is more of a private-public relationship, much like the DoD handles things, or other departments. Because there's not enough money to do this extra stuff, but it's needed.
Well, we do spend $1.9 trillion on the healthcare costs of poor nutrition, so we're spending the money.
Well, no, yeah. So the money is maybe just how it's allocated back to private industry to do the things that inherently it wants to do, but we have these stopgaps in.
I have heard a raise that the scale of basic research in ag is not anything close to what NIH does or what anybody's done in DoD. One nice thing about DoD is that military is the government is the customer.
Yeah.
Which is, I've noticed this between like working with DARPA versus ARPA. The DARPA never got political. It more recently has gotten political, but it was the work we were doing at DARPA was warfighter centric.
Yeah.
Because the warfighter was setting the mission. What I've noticed in some of the other areas is when you get over to DOE or you get into some of their ARPA-like efforts, all of a sudden there's some political agenda intermixed, so maybe there's a way to correct that. Gates, I think, especially as it applies to Africa, like he's been doing a lot of work in small molecules in Africa to make them more effective in precision, where you couldn't even think about doing that work in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are a lot of reasons why small molecule still makes a lot of sense, especially when I talk to somebody like Kep Tom, he's like, I put down half the amount of chemicals as anybody else because I in for our precision application in it, and I don't, and it saves me money. So I think yes. I have no idea how it would manifest itself. The other part of it is system architecture. So there are two things you got to manage here. One, you got to get dollars in. Two, you have to accept that the system architecture might change. So right now, everybody's figuring out how to use soy somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But to get nutrition right in food for soy may require a specialized vertical chain of soy down that path.
Yeah.
Versus fuels. And that is a very confused situation, which I'm not even positive that the net that's true. Some days, we did this on a special chat over the weekend. It's like, what if we didn't have 80 million acres focused to biofuels? Would we know what to do with ourselves?
That brings up another point I was thinking last night through this conversation is, okay, say we even solve all these things we're talking about. Say the money's there, we put the right stuff where it is. But to talking earlier, a lot of the crops are used for fuel. It's just a different, oil content is maybe more wanted than nutritional content, although they probably correlate with each other somehow. So much is used for fuel. Well, with you could call it from the electrical car movement, EVs, all that fun stuff. The world is changing towards more efficient ways to travel. Normal traditional fuel, though, is also not going away overnight. And, so much of the corn and soybean industry, especially the corn industry, is propped up through ethanol. Well, that's going to change in time. What do we do with those acres? Well, one of the things that is starting to happen is here in North Dakota, the Corn Belt is moving up this way. It's slowly getting warmer, moisture trends have been better. Land is cheaper, rent and to buy it. It's just cheaper to farm more acres here. And in a lot of ways, we can get some of the similar yields to many places in the Corn Belt that are 2, 3, 4 times more expensive. And with the shift in, and this is more maybe the social side of all of this that creates another complexity, is with the prices of land and then people in the next 20 years, people dying, retiring out of ag or land changing hands. There's this massive land transfer in all of rural America and beyond. How is that going to affect all these things? If there's a soybean crushing plant being built literally 6 miles down the road from it. Huge plant, like $800 million facility. That'll probably work here for quite some time. They're not building those things anymore brand new in certain parts of the country too. Or they maybe see the light. They say like, well, you can't grow soybeans here. It's cheaper. You're not going to be able to. You're not able to plant there. Mm-hmm. All these crushing plants are getting built up north. It's like there's this trend. They're aware of things moving. How is that going to transition all this stuff too and affect everything? And we're not going to need as much ethanol 50 years from now, unless I don't see the math to it, I guess, right now, unless it turns in, unless all fuel goes, all gasoline fuel, kind of like Brazil does with sugarcane, all the vehicles run on mostly ethanol versus fossil fuels, which lobbying could change that. Lobbyists, as we talked about earlier, are powerful people that want to get things done. How does that?
Well, the oil guys have played this game for 150 years. And they've lived through about 20 episodes where people said they were going to be put out of business.
Well, they'll maybe, what my theory is I could see, just because of the political pressure of fossil fuels and oil coming out of the ground being a problem, is they'll change their role slowly to say, oh, no, we're going to change it to ethanol. And with land changing, oil groups will just end up where you can buy up all the land, buy up all the ethanol places and say, well, yeah, now we're going to do 85% ethanol in cars. But they still control the
you might narrative. See them do something different, which is they understand how to get oil. And if all the other mechanisms run out of effort, then demand for oil, everybody always goes back to the oil. Yeah. And so what they've done over time is like they invested in DAC, the direct air capture, which is voodoo physics. But they did it really to like, okay, yeah, sure. You want to do DAC? Go ahead. And they know that in 15 years, everyone will realize it's voodoo physics and they're going to be back to gas. And they'll charge 20% more for that gas. So there's a little of that dynamic. The dynamic, I do want to bounce back a little bit to the dynamic on the farm. And we are seeing, this is the work that Aimpoint's been publishing, where they've said, look, the bulk of production in row crops comes from about 85,000 farmers.
Yeah.
And their forecast is that's going to go to 60,000 farmers. So then,
I saw a post you do that the other day, and
but what is like internally, what does that mean? And so, at least in my conversations with some of those 85,000, is it gets back to this regenerative thing a little bit. It's like we're pretty good at figuring out these practices, and so what do you do to scale? Are you going to buy land? And like they're moving into, no, we're not going to buy more land. We're going to rent more land. And there more and more of them are saying, I've got the practices down. That gets my margins right. It makes me a smarter renter of land because I understand where it fits into the cost equation. and the other people competing for that land don't understand that. Yeah. And so they're getting more and more in a position where they can say, I will buy land as I see fit, but I'm going to rent land. I'm going to produce on it. I'm going to use my formula. I may have a 20,000 acre operation. My kids will turn it into a 35,000 acre operation on rented land, and will be more productive than anybody else. And 85,000 will go to 60. And so as we think about like, how do we do this? It's going to happen. Maybe it's not the diffusion of technology from early adopters to laggards. It is early adopters taking out the laggards.
100%. This is happening where I live. This is happening in Western Canada. It's how it works. Those exact same points. Those types of things are happening up here. I'd say they are slower going. And that's maybe to my other point of where some of the production and some of the technology pieces, a stat that came out, and I did a post on it a little while ago, like North Dakota, where I'm at, is the highest use of precision ag technologies. A lot of reasons why, but one of the reasons is exactly what you just said, is larger farms they're figuring out their formulas, and they can scale certain precision ag practices and ag technology faster and more efficiently. They just can. Maybe it's the lay of the land. Sometimes it's maybe politics. It's weather. We're forced to do it earlier and faster and bigger because we'd have limited time.
They can also hire a full human to do the work.
Yeah.
I mean, like if you're running 20,000 out, you can hire like a person whose job is to build better processes. If you're running a 2,000 acre farm, that's like, hey son, I'd like to get you back to the farm. Can you figure out how to do this on your spare time?
Yeah. And that's the big kind of cultural change. And I mean, where I grew up, as we were talking earlier, is 500 people. Well, that was when I grew up. It's 300 now. My class is 24 people. That was the biggest class in like 10 years at that point. Normal classes are 8 to 10 people. Oh. And this is where a big push of robotics is going too. Of course, there's limits in that as well. But then if the production it's kind of like, where are we setting, and maybe this gets back all to the nutritional side too, as I was also thinking last night, is like the bigger farms are going to get bigger and they're going to stick to main staple commodities because they can, they're built that way, they've evolved that way. Other areas though of the country I see, where there are smaller farms, I mean, they're going to die away for these same reasons. Someone's not coming back, or, the person they were renting it from, or they can't buy more land because it's getting so expensive. Maybe they'll try to rent land, but they can't outbid the big guy because for all the economical reasons why it's hard to do that at times. And those guys have figured out their formula. They can produce things on an efficiency scale just much higher. It's like, well, what do these other farms do? What happens to them? And there's been this problem in ag technology being so focused on the large ones, which is problematic for adoption, with some softwares and different data sets, was like, oh, there's only like 10,000 people that will buy this shit. That's just how it is. Like, and you got $1 billion fighting after 10,000 people. That's kind of some of the problems in ag tech has been lately. Is we're just fighting after the same 5%ers, and they're just tired. It's like, we have our system in place. We have it. We're good. And to your point, they're just going to buy out the other guys that aren't doing it over time. And slowly, some of them will adopt as well. But then, no one wants to sell technology to smaller farms because, they can't afford it. They don't want to pay for X, Y, Z. Well, maybe we want to, and so that's the fuel people. Let's just call it giant commodities fuel people. Some of that production is even getting switched to other countries. South America, Africa is a growing, burgeoning place for that too, with the amount of people and land they have. What if we maybe rethink the purpose of what, these smaller farms are? Maybe they are the key people who invest in on the nutritional side of it. It's like, and focus on that in that smaller realm. Because the large guys are just going to do what they do. The system's going to follow them. It'll be what it is. But if you think of investing in that mid-range, smaller farm to be the more the food side of it, the nutritional side, and give them an option.
Would they rotate to other crops like specialty?
I think they would if given the right mechanisms. Because right now they're fighting the large system of commodities. They're not given an option to say, oh, like how a lot of farms here were, and there still are, they'll grow 6, 8 different crops, where a lot of the small farms are concentrated just on corn and beans because of the efficiencies of them. Well, the larger ones are going to take that away from them. What if we give them more option to say, hey, small farm of 1,000 acres in southern Indiana, you've been doing corn and beans for the last 100 years or 50 years or whatever. We need to help you transition to grow 10 different crops that are meant for these different markets, specific for these types of foods, for these CPG, the materials that they're making to try to make more nutrient dense material. And you're in the bread basket of people anyways. And there's a lot of that manufacturing there anyways. It's like we need to separate. We're putting all farmers of major production into one big basket of all these staple commodity crops. You need to separate it into two. Say, no, you're here. That's where you are. You're here. You're more for the nutrient food side. You're large commodity energy feed.
Can you imagine them going to their banker? It's like Field of Dreams. You want to build a what?
No, I know that's the problem. Changing the culture of that is an immense problem. Unless you can put some incentives in. I don't know if the USDA can play that game or not. Of course,
I'll give you one play here, which was World Wildlife Foundation put out a paper 2019 called The Next California, and they basically looked at call it 25 crops in California and said 20 of these really should move to the Mid-South. The got water, the evolution of climate, you can beat production. They had a labor issue that hadn't solved, but now if you go to policy, when they put that together and we were involved in part of that, it's like, well, how do we make that happen? How do you decide? Where do you adjudicate that we can keep trying to figure out how to manage water in California and have fights over water in California? We just move all this at a national level. You would sort of say, as a nation, we should move this stuff over here, but you've got so much rent seeking in the pile that there are twists and turns. Like, you want to grow almonds where there's water? Are you kidding me? Why would you do that? There was some conversation going on that a witness in an upcoming hearing in the Senate is to be, the main reason why we can't have good food is because farmers are evil. Or I've heard recently, I'm a McKinsey consultant, and I've read every book there is raised about regenerative, and I'm going to teach farmers about cover crops.
I did a post on that about some guy from Europe.
It's like
he read 30 regenerative books, and I was like, I'm going to be regenerative king now or something. And I was like, no, you suck.
It's like one, I think pretty much farmers know what a cover crop is. And two, the most sustainable farmer in the world is a 7th generation farmer, as evidenced by their 7th generation. And three, you can't get cover crops properly done in your FCS and your insurance programs. Will say, you want to do what? So, I mean, the person who cares the most about soil health on the face of the planet is the farmer.
That is typically the truth. Yes.
And the system around it thinks that they don't, which is insane to me. But it's a little bit of a non sequitur. But I don't know the answer. You can imagine if there's smaller operations and they rotate and they could do integrated livestock, that I don't know, it has to be integrated livestock, but
that's a very helpful thing though.
Yeah,
it works well. But yes, it's complex. Complexity.
I would say on the larger operations, I was toying with the idea that there's a business model for livestock as a service. Like if you want rangelands, it's super expensive, and farmers need cows to show up for the winter.
Yeah, like I've thought of.
Seems like you guys could figure this out somehow. And
some kind of. I mean, some people locally do it a little bit, but the problem in that is moving a massive amount of cattle somewhere. There's health issues.
We had. I mean, where the buffalo roamed. I mean, they used to run around on their own, and they figured it out.
They were all around me. Yep.
But for special forces, we took a rat and stuck a thing in its brain, and you put a camera on it, and you could drive the rat around inside to go look inside to see where a terrorist was by giving it its brain right and left signals. So maybe you could.
Is that what cows?
Just stick a little thing in a cow, and I don't know who listens to your podcast here, but we're probably going to get PETA or whatever is going to.
It's the more crazy, the better. I don't care.
But somebody was telling me that they used to. I didn't know this, but it used to be early days. Like a train would be stopped for 2 days while a buffalo herd would go past.
Yeah. And that's why Buffalo Bill is super successful, because they put people in trains and he shot all these buffalo, and was also to kill them off to displace Native American tribes, because that was their main food source. So the whole point of Buffalo Bill and doing what he was doing a lot was to
control the tribes,
to eradicate them.
Huh. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's a fun fact of the day, I guess, of why the buffalo were actually shot and killed. It was to displace Native Americans into smaller areas, because that was their main food source.
Well, it would be interesting. I mean, like, just again, being like technology geek about this, if you could autonomously steer livestock around and not have to worry about fences and
variable rate pooping. Do variable rate pooping with livestock. I'm for it. You got a big fund of money, right? Let's take that idea and
I am not soliciting for investment, but we always need more investment. I will say right now is the worst time possible in venture capital. Venture capitalists, just to tell you this pain. So people are like, oh, you're a venture capitalist. Why aren't you investing in us? Well, I raise money from other people, and then I invested in startups. Yep. So I'm a cog in the food chain. I'm not sure whether I'm where I am in that food chain, but LPs, the people who invest in venture capital funds, if they're institutional investors, bond interest rates goes up, which means their bond portfolio goes down. They have to put more money in bonds, so they got to take money out of venture capital, and venture capital is illiquid, so it takes some time to pull it out, and so they're still doing that. And so we've seen a huge decline in investing because of that exogenous force. There are people that are worried about climate. There are worried about food. They are worried about nutrition. They're sort of on the sidelines, but we need more investment. I would say in general, I don't consider us an ag tech investor per se. We're a food is health. How do we get nutritional density? I'm unsure to what degree those levers are in ag tech, and so we're a little opportunistic. In a sense, our job to our investors is find something that's getting me a return. You talked about all this how to change the world stuff, but I'm only going to give you money if you can get me a return.
Oh, well, see, that is what it always, actually, the beginnings of ag tech and how I grew up through it, that's exactly how it worked. You created something, if it didn't make money, well, you just weren't in business. That was just the nature of the beast. And then a lot of money came in for good reason. More was needed. But we maybe chased too many ideas that were new and novel to disrupt, and instead maybe some of that money should have just been pumped into things that were known to work. I've seen some of the detrimental sides of that on multiple sides of it, but maybe one where money is needed in the tech side to help on the nutritional point, like to my little earlier point, is if you can get the large farms are going to do what they're going to do. It's basically game, set, match, kind of where that's going. There's an avenue, I think, for other farms to get into this nutritional part of it, but they need money. They need understanding. Maybe, and this is a really broad thing, not like a specific thing to put money into, but somehow showcase to these like a plan of attack on a broader sense for farms. Say that example of a southern Indiana farm, to say, here's a plan of the things that are actually needed to help other companies that need these types of commodity crops to build these more nutrient dense products.
Well, I think,
and give them a roadmap, like somehow give them a roadmap fiscally and management wise, saying, this can work. It takes some time, but it can transition away from this to this, and give them hope.
Yeah. So in our fundraising, we used to go out and say, fundraising to our LPs, we used to go out and say, don't you understand how awful it is that people are dying from this? And we had these 10 slides on people are dying, it's awful. And finally, a really good investor, that a sell-side analyst at Oppenheimer, said, we all get it. Every single one of us wakes up every morning thinking we're eating the wrong stuff and doing the wrong stuff. How do we solve it? And they're like, oh, we don't need to convince you that you're not taking care of yourself.
We all know we're dying.
So, and we haven't done this yet, but what's the roadmap out? Now, when I look at things like Grand Farm, I think Grand Farm up in Fargo is a good example, and there should be a Grand Farm. We've sort of talked about this. There should be like a Grand Farm in many locations. That
I live literally 6 miles away from that farm.
Oh, that's so cool. It's like Disneyland for farming, isn't it?
So if you come up here, you'll have to I
got to get up there, because we've talked about it, and I'm thinking I'd spend a lot of time in northern Michigan. I'm like, let's build a Grand Farm here too.
Well, it's a good template. Then they got Olds College up in Alberta, which is another kind of similar route. But yeah, every state or region of the state should have its own Grand Farm too.
Yeah, I've got a little
processes.
I've got a little paper I put together that I tried to maybe push the USDA to say, encourage every state to create their own and do it. Like if you're in Wyoming, it's around beef. If you're if you're in Michigan, it's around specialty crops.
They just won. They're part of it in a bigger, huge grant. It would be up to 150 million over 10 years, I think, of investment into ag technologies and testing and processing and R&D. They won that from the government. I can't remember if it was from the USDA or from sort of some other faction. But I think they're doing this as it's a footprint for that kind of. It's like, okay, if this can work, then yes, we'll put more funding into
and
similar things.
Sonny Perdue is asked them to build a replica down in Georgia, or to help them, because he's now, Sonny Perdue, I think, is now over the Georgia system overall, so he's got ag extension.
He was up here looking through it all a few years ago, and that was.
The other thing here, again, I'll geek out on economics. So the should the government do it in one big chunk, or should the market do it? And is venture capital allocating stuff in the wrong way? That's something referred to in economics called the coordination problem. It was defined by Hayek. Hayek is out of the Chicago School of Economics, which tends to be a very libertarian viewpoint. And if you go back to a classic paper that Hayek wrote, it says The Power of Knowledge in Society. It was written right around 1948. And he said the definition of an entrepreneur is someone that can go out into the marketplace and hear 5 different voices about a problem and see the thing that intersects those 5 problems and solves it. And his argument, and I think it's an argument I believe, is the capital allocation process of coordination will never be super efficient, but it can be more efficient. That in centralized out of the government doesn't have enough signal from that, can't hear those 5 different people. So it can never get the coordination problem right. The reason why DARPA works is the warfighters in their system, they hear the voice. And the reason why they get it wrong in other places is because rent seekers are in the way, preventing it, lobbyists.
Yeah.
So what Hayek would say is venture capital, even though it blows a lot of money, overall, net, is a better way to coordinate in that uncertainty how to get that. So then you say, okay, great paper, very insightful in 1948, was presumed really what later on would become big data on signals analysis. And so that's really cool. We just had this cool conversation about a paper, really one of the best papers in the last 100 years in economics. What does it mean today? And what it means is early adopter customers. It means, what does every startup need? They need a customer. You need to have somebody say, I'm frustrated. I'm a mom trying to feed my kids, and Nestle's trying to tell me I've got to stop eating meat, and I got to worry about the climate, and I'm worried about my kids' health. I need to go out to Instagram people to find better recipes, to find healthy recipes for my kids, to pull this together. Why can't I walk into a grocery store and have them basically say, eat this, don't eat that? And why do I have to walk into 60,000 SKUs and just throw up my hands and be lost? Can't somebody give me, why am I getting a health app about what to do from the doctor I see once a year, instead of, why doesn't Walmart have a health app that helps me understand and look at my cash register receipt and tell me, you're off by a little bit. It's nudging. Why can't your wife, who's seeing people in a clinical environment, be sitting there right at Walmart, and when somebody walks in whose BMI is 35, they go into a lane over towards her, and she says, look, we're not going to put you on Ozempic for a long time, but we're going to do it for a little bit, and we're going to do this other stuff around muscle enhancement, and we're going to get you into this keto thing, and don't go in this aisle and go into this aisle, and when you're eating pasta, don't eat this pasta, eat this pasta. So the getting into the intensity of that. Now, what we're doing on the farmer side, and I think what we're going to do with Kevin Van Trump at FarmCon this coming year, is we might, like you had at World Agritech, have companies that are presenting, but not presenting to raise money. Have them present to early adopter customers. What we have failed at on our team is get closer to farmers who are early adopter customers, who can say to the startups, what does every startup need? They need a customer. Who can say, when I look at all of our companies that have started to become successful, it's because they beat through this process over time to finally find where their customers were, to learn how to listen to their customers and take what originated as a good idea. And they were distracted because they had people on their board who were VCs that say, I think this.
Yeah.
Instead of getting closer to the voice.
That was one of the most frustrating things probably in the last 10 years for sure. And some of it too was some were reaching out to farmers, but they were they were only concentrating on farmers that put themselves out there to say something. And there's also a lot of farmers that had a lot to say but were never asked too, of like, how does your system? Because, I mean, okay, fair point on all that. When you brought up like Kip Tom, well, everyone asks Kip Tom what to do. Everyone asked XYZ Farm what to do, because then they said, oh, I talked to that guy, and it just kind of streamed down. It's like, I'll tell you this. Met Kip Tom, nice guy and all that. He knows shit about farming where I grew up. and same as I know shit about farming in other parts of the country too. It wasn't broad enough. Like more was needed there. But cascade into what it was.
Well, one thing I could use help for on this is we, on row crops, we're regionalizing the perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kip sort of has a good voice around the I states.
Yeah.
Matt Moreland around, East, and Matt is a guy we listen to who's down about an hour south of Wichita. So he's crappy soil, center pivots, not exactly the right thing, but there's a really neat crowd up in Nebraska. A lot of really aggressive young farmers, and I also spent some time listening to Debbie Borg up there, and she's more on the she's part of the Costco chicken program. So they're much more about more about that and related farm activity for that. I'm starting to really appreciate the Nebraska crowd.
You would you got to come up here. There's we're a fun group. Plus we grow like 30 different staple crops.
So there's that. I think I don't know. Maybe why don't we do? Are we gonna do like a barbecue over at Grand Farm and get everybody together or something?
We'll just call it barbecue and bush light. That'll do the crowd. You go.
When is it going to be like a? I should ask them. It's like a 2-day thing.
Yeah, there's a Cultivate conference in the end of June. Should come up for that. It's when they do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, why don't you send me that? I'd like to.
Yeah.
We were thinking. Jordan Van Trump and I were thinking about, since he's been doing the ag swag thing, that we would maybe just get a bus and travel around and catch up with people more directly for like a couple of weeks, and he gets all ag swag, and we could just sort of go hang out and get our aptitude improved.
Makes sense. But well, anyways, we've been we're almost at 2 hours now.
I hope everyone's not bored.
Yeah,
was this good? Is this what you wanted?
No, works good. So I'll we'll kind of close it up for now, unless you got any last quick little thoughts on where technology and ag, from your point of view.
We're going to get rid of type 2 diabetes. That's what I'm doing.
That is my wife as well, in her own way. So
it's
there's a big effort. It's just connecting all the pieces together. So
now we're going to do it.
Ozempic, I guess.
It's part of the mix.
It is part of the mix. But anyways, well, we'll close it up here. Thanks, Carter, for the long talk. Very informative. Hopefully people can parse through all the different viewpoints. Luckily, there's an AI script thing I use that
they can get
funnels it all down into different parts, so they'll probably forget like the last 10 minutes.
I think I've written half my lessons learned of the week thing today.
Hey, perfect. I'll send you the transcript part of that, and then you can just kind of.
I can remember what I said. It's like, did I say that?
It's all in there. I'll send it to you. It'll be like 100 pages long if you really want it, but then it can break it down too.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's good to have these conversations. I think I do them because I learned something in the process. It just sometimes takes me a week to realize what I learned.
Yeah, it's the nature of the beast. But anyways, I'll close up this podcast for now of Ag Uncensored, and thanks again, Carter, for being on.
Thank you.
Yeah. See you next time.